Hey everyone, this is Cobain the Christian. I want to do a quick video explaining why naturalism is so problematic. And what I mean by naturalism is what most people just call atheism. But I don't want to call it atheism because atheism is just the belief that there isn't any such person as God. You can be an atheist and a Buddhist, for example, but that's not what most people mean when they call themselves atheists. Instead, when they call themselves atheists, what they really mean is something like naturalism or physicalism or materialism. The belief that the universe constitutes the whole of existence, that the regularities of the universe are self-perpetuating, and that we don't need anything but matter in order to explain why we're conscious, why we can discern reality, and so on and so forth. Now, a lot of people, they come at this question empirically. They say, well, there isn't any empirical evidence for God or for the soul or anything like that, and I think they're false in that, but I think this is actually the wrong way to begin a line of thinking. It's natural to begin a line of thinking this way because this is the way we usually think. We don't think about the metaphysical questions instinctively. But I want to emphasize that metaphysical questions are not any less real or important than empirical questions. And before I say anything else, let me just say something about mind. Because a lot of people talk about the soul, but don't really know what they mean by the soul. Now, traditionally, the soul has just been considered the aspect of a person which has the faculty of consciousness. Now, you could be a Cartesian with respect to the soul, in which case you think that the soul is just that which has the faculty of consciousness and rationality, and that it interacts with the body-brain system in some unknown way. Descartes held it was through the pineal gland, but nobody really holds that anymore. But the reason that something like the soul must exist is metaphysical, though I think there is empirical evidence for things like psychic phenomena, and I think neuroplasticity provides some good evidence for the existence of a mind distinct from the body. But the chief reason why the mind cannot be identical to the body is metaphysical. And I can demonstrate it to you with absolute certainty, just as I could demonstrate to you that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Now, that example of 2 plus 2 equals 4 is an important one, because we recognize that there can't be any such thing as empirical evidence for the proposition. Instead, it's necessarily true. So if you're demanding empirical evidence for the soul, and you say, well, there can't be any kind of evidence but empirical evidence, well, then you've undermined your own belief that 2 plus 2 equals 4, as well as a host of beliefs that I'll get into some other time. But here's the argument, that the soul or mind must be distinct from your body. The argument starts with a basic principle of logic, namely the law of identity. A is equal to A. A thing is identical to itself in every respect. But we should also recognize the extension of the law of identity, which is sometimes called Leibniz's law. And this holds that if one thing is identical to another, then they must have exactly the same properties. Everything true of one must be true of the other, and everything that is possible for one must be possible for the other. So if I say, my paternal uncle is identical to Uncle Charlie, then everything that is true of my paternal uncle will be true of my Uncle Charlie. They'll have the same age, the same thoughts, the same history, the same hair color, the same future, and everything that's possible for my paternal uncle will likewise be possible for my Uncle Charlie. Now, it's necessarily true that they cannot have any distinctions between them. If they have even one distinction, it demonstrates, just as certainly as 2 plus 2 equals 4, it demonstrates that they cannot be identical. So, with respect to the mind and the body, the most basic and, in my view, decisive argument that materialism cannot be true is that there are things true of the mind that are not true of the brain. So, one of the most commonly talked about aspects of the distinction has to do with something philosophers call intentionality. And intentionality is just the property of a thought wherein that thought is about something else, right? So I'm thinking about this video, or I'm thinking about what people are going to say, or I'm thinking about the color of my wall, or what I just watched on TV. All of my thoughts have this property of being about something. But if you think about material things, they're not about anything at all. So take my wall. It would be a non-question to say, what is my wall about? Any intentionality that exists on my wall can only exist in the mind. That is, I designed the wall with a particular intent or meaning in mind, and if nobody perceives it, then it has no intentionality. This is similarly true for a neural connection. A neural connection in and of itself is not about anything. It makes no sense to say that neural connection is false. It just is. It has certain material properties. And so the property of being about something, or intentionality, is an irreducible distinction between mental events and the corresponding physical events in the brain. Another property that must be, which is distinct from between the mind and the brain, has to do with divisibility. If I take a brain out of someone and I divide it in half, then what I have is two halves of one brain. But if the brain is identical to the mind, then it follows that the mind must likewise be divisible into parts. But this is impossible. Imagine that I took those two halves of the brain and I instantiated each of them in a new person. What we would have is not one half or two halves of one mind. We would have two minds. That is, we would have two loci or centers of subjective experience. The two would have their own memories and history and future, and they would experience different things. In other words, we would have two complete minds. Now, they might have defective capacities. They might be mentally challenged. But that's not a half of a mind. That's just two minds, each with defective capacities. They don't have the same abilities that a fully functioning mind has. Now, the fact that you can divide a brain, but you can't divide a mind, means that there is a difference, a real distinction, between the properties and possibilities that are true of each of them. And it follows necessarily and certainly that the mind cannot be identical to the brain. This is a huge problem for materialism, and it's one that if you read materialist philosophy of mind, you're just not going to find an answer. There's been a lot of work trying to find an answer, but in the end, it either ends up denying consciousness. Susan Blackmore is a naturalist psychologist, simply says that consciousness does not exist, which is absurd because I'm having qualitative experiences. To say that consciousness is an illusion is like saying that there is such a thing as a square circle. Illusion itself is a state of consciousness. It's when I perceive something qualitatively that is in discord with what objectively exists outside the mind. You can't bring in mind in order to deny the mind. Or else, a materialist will end up trying to redefine consciousness as something it's not. But whenever they try to redefine consciousness, or reduce it to a material substrate, you just have to ask yourself, is everything true of mental events true of the corresponding physical events? And ask yourself that question seriously. You're going to find that always there is a distinction between them, and it follows that they must be distinct. Now, it's not just Christians or theists who are saying this. Thomas Nagel, who is an atheist philosopher, has critiqued materialism on these grounds. If you study metaphysics, and if you study philosophy, you will find that naturalism is not obviously true, like so many naturalists on the internet seem to think it is. There are many problems with naturalism. So, I'll end this video here, but I hope to make this maybe into a series of some kind, where I'll just explain in what I hope to be relatively simple terms why naturalism is not obviously true, and why indeed there are many, many metaphysical problems with the naturalistic worldview. So thanks very much for listening, and I hope, even if you're not convinced wholly, that it will stimulate your thought, and that you will begin to reflect on these questions and read about them. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions, make sure to state them in the comments.